Jamal Thompson, the town's well-respected police chief, sat in his cozy kitchen, sipping his freshly brewed coffee as he tapped away on his laptop. It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind he cherished. The sun filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow across the room. With a few clicks, Jamal changed the Wi-Fi password, something he had been meaning to do for a while. A simple task done in peace. Jamal enjoyed the calm after a week of running the department. The weight of his position was often heavy, but this moment was his to enjoy. Little did he know, his small, mundane action would set off a chain of events that would disturb the peace of the entire neighborhood. As Jamal relaxed, unaware, his next-door neighbor, Karen Whitman, was just beginning her morning, unaware of the trouble she was about to create. Across the street, Karen Whitman sat by her window, staring out at her perfect suburban view. Her morning coffee was barely touched, her eyes scanning every detail outside, looking for anything that seemed out of place. She was a woman who didn't miss much, and today, something caught her attention. Jamal was sitting in his front yard, tapping on his laptop and fiddling with his Wi-Fi router. She squinted, watching his every move. There was something about it that made her uneasy, something that didn't sit right. In her mind, Jamal's behavior seemed suspicious. He was changing his password, sure, but she couldn't help but wonder if he was up to something more. Maybe hacking into her network? A black man like him, with his quiet demeanor, didn't sit well with her, in her world. Things like this weren't coincidences. As Karen sat, her mind racing with thoughts of Jamal's intentions, she turned her attention to her own internet. Her screen froze, and she noticed her Wi-Fi connection had suddenly cut out. A low groan escaped her lips as she tried rebooting her router, but to no avail. Her internet was down, and there was no apparent reason why. Her first instinct was to blame Jamal. It couldn't just be a coincidence, could it? She stared at her phone screen, calculating. He was too close. He had to be the one responsible. Her paranoia, already in overdrive, painted a clear picture. Jamal must have hacked into her system. That's the only explanation that made sense. Fueled by her growing sense of injustice, Karen marched out the door, her eyes fixed on Jamal's front yard. Her steps were firm, deliberate, as if she were heading into battle. Her mind was made up. She was going to confront him. "Hey!" Karen's voice rang out as she approached. Jamal looked up, surprised, but his calm demeanor never faltered. "You hacked my Wi-Fi," she accused, pointing a finger at him. Jamal's brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about, Karen?" he asked, trying to understand where this was coming from. "I'm just changing my password, nothing more." But Karen was already too deep into her delusions. "I know what you're doing. You think I don't see it? I'm calling the co." Karen's anger flared. She was convinced now. There was no reasoning with someone like Jamal, a man she deemed untrustworthy in her world. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "911, what's your emergency?" the operator asked. "I need the police right now." Karen almost shouted. "There's a man in my yard, and he's been messing with my Wi-Fi. He's acting suspicious, and he's threatening me." The operator paused. "Ma'am, is he physically threatening you?" Karen hesitated, but pushed ahead. "Yes, he's being aggressive, and I'm scared." Her voice quivered with manufactured fear, and she hung up, feeling a false sense of power course through her veins. She knew the police would come, and she knew Jamal would be exposed for what he truly was, someone to be feared. It didn't take long for the sirens to wail in the distance. Karen's heart began to race as she looked toward the end of the block. She stood near her window, her eyes darting between the approaching squad cars and Jamal, who was still seated in his yard, seemingly unaware of the chaos about to unfold. The squad car pulled to a stop, and two officers stepped out, both alert, ready for a situation that they thought might involve an aggressive suspect. Karen's face lit up as she pointed at Jamal. "That's him," she cried. "He's been harassing me. He's threatening me right now." The officers nodded and started toward Jamal, who stood slowly, not all alarmed. He knew the drill. He was a police chief, after all, and he was well accustomed to handling situations like this, just not from a neighbor. The officers approached Jamal with a stern look, their hands resting on their belts, ready to handle a potential threat. But as they got closer and saw Jamal's face clearly, their expressions shifted from one of caution to recognition. "Chief Thompson?" one of the officers asked, his voice laced with surprise. Karen froze. Her eyes widened in horror as she processed the words. This wasn't just any man. This was the town's police chief, the very person who commanded the officers in the squad cars. She had made a terrible mistake. Her stomach churned, realizing that in her haste to accuse him, she had not only misjudged Jamal, but had also escalated the situation to a point she couldn't control. The two officers exchanged glances before turning to Karen. "Ma'am," the other officer said with a stern tone, "we'll need to talk to you about making false reports to emergency services." Karen's face turned beet red as the reality of her actions dawned on her. The officer's eyes softened, but there was no sympathy in their gaze. "We don't take calls like these lightly," the first officer continued. "Falsely accusing someone, especially the police chief, of something like this is a serious matter." Jamal, unfazed by the drama unfolding, stood quietly to the side, watching as Karen began to stutter, attempting to defend herself. The officers stepped toward Karen, their demeanor serious, but Karen couldn't hold her ground. Her pride crumbled under their disapproving gaze. She had hoped to feel vindicated, but now she only felt small. The tension that had once been palpable in the air now hung heavy with embarrassment. Her mind raced, looking for an escape. I just thought," Karen stammered, unable to form a coherent explanation. But nothing she said could undo the mess she had created. Her hand trembled as she clutched her phone, feeling the weight of her mistake. The officers weren't angry, but the way they looked at her was far worse. The silent disappointment was enough to leave her feeling utterly humiliated. Through the entire exchange, Jamal remained calm. He had seen his fair share of tense situations, but this one was different. There was no need to get riled up over Karen's baseless accusations. Her behavior wasn't new. People like her existed everywhere. Jamal took a slow sip of his coffee, watching the officers finish their talk with Karen. He wasn't angry or upset. He was simply amused at the irony of the situation. He had spent his entire career de-escalating conflicts, but never had he imagined something as bizarre as this. As the officers walked back to their car, Jamal couldn't help but shake his head. In his line of work, he had learned not to take things personally, and today was no exception. Karen, now thoroughly humiliated, retreated to her house without another word. She slammed the door behind her, unable to look anyone in the eye. The damage was done, and there was no way to take back the false accusation she had made. Jamal, meanwhile, returned to his home. His day had been interrupted, but not in a way that would shake him. He sat back down at his kitchen table, his coffee still warm. He had always prided himself on remaining level-headed, and today was no different. He couldn't help but chuckle quietly to himself, relishing the irony. Karen had tried to accuse him of wrongdoing, and instead, she had exposed herself as the one in the wrong. As the afternoon sun began to set, Jamal reflected on the strange turn of events. He had faced many challenges in his career, but today's situation was one of the more bizarre ones. But what stood out the most wasn't the confrontation. It was the lesson that came with it. In a world quick to judge, the truth had a way of revealing itself. He knew that Karen wouldn't soon forget the humiliation she had faced, and it was unlikely that she would ever look at him the same way again. But as Jamal sipped the last of his coffee, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had faced a baseless accusation with grace and emerged unscathed. The town had learned an important lesson, and so had Karen. Jamal smiled to himself, content in the knowledge that sometimes the truth had a way of turning a situation around, just like today.